Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you. If you are able to have your cameras on, we'd love that. If you can't, we completely understand. Welcome. My name is Andy Engel, and I lead virtual public programs at Reimagine. I want to welcome you all to the final session of this three-part series called Pieces of Me. This month, we've been exploring the grief that we experience due to changes in identity and when significant events in our life alter our sense of self. I'm going to give you a visual description for those who may not be able to see me. I am a white cisgender male with glasses, salt and pepper hair, a black and white patterned shirt, and I've got a bright orange wall in my background. Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. People of different backgrounds, different ages, races, sexual orientations, gender identities, people of faith, people of no faith, all coming together to heal ourselves, our communities, and the world. We support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality, and we transform life's biggest challenges into action and growth. Reimagine resources, support groups, events like this one today are free or sliding scale and accessible to the public. This is made possible by the support and generosity of participants like you. So for those who already made a tax-deductible donation when you registered, thank you so much. Your gift will immediately support Reimagine's mission to help people of all walks of life transform the hard parts into purpose and meaning. So tonight is all about action. We've learned from panelists in our first session all about the experiences and all the wisdom that we could gather on this topic of identity and ambiguous loss. Our second session was more focused on the body, where we were led by Sundari Malcolm in breathing, in breath work. And now we're taking small, sweet steps to transform our grief into growth, into wisdom and self-knowledge. Our facilitator tonight, I'll say more about her soon, Stephanie Sarazin, will be in conversation with Sara Luria and Brenda Salgado, two spiritual leaders who design creative rituals for losses associated with identity change. And what's the format tonight? So we'll have about 35 minutes of discussion with our guests. That will be followed with 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. So for those of you who have questions during this conversation with our three guests, please start using the chat to enter those questions. I will collect those and I will share them with our speakers when we get to the Q&A. And then after Q&A, we'll have 15 minutes of breakout sessions. So that's that. And I wanted to give a special shout out to our community of collaborators at Reimagine. They host events on our platform. You can too. We've been encouraging this cohort to present programs this month on this theme of identity loss. So please check these out. There's one additional event on September 24th. Let me interview you. So I hope you can join that as well. And now, before we begin, just a few Zoom tips. For those who wish, you can click on the CC icon at the bottom of the screen to get a live transcript of what's being said. Feel free to send me or Nicole Tan. Hello, Nicole. Thank you so much for helping us out, my colleague at Reimagine. Please send us a note in the chat if you're having any problems. Everyone who has registered for this gathering will get a follow-up email with links about all of our special guests and a link to the recording. So now I will stop. A few words about our special guest tonight. Sara Luria is a rabbi and cultivator of ideas and dreams. She is currently leading Beloved Garden, a network of spiritual leaders planting new projects and communities. Sara was the founder and executive director of ImmerseNYC, a community mikveh project. And for those who may not know, a mikveh is an immersion in water to mark life transitions such as weddings, births, healing from illness or trauma, and other types of life cycle events. Brenda Salgado, she is an author, wisdom keeper, and an organizational and movement consultant. She has trained with various elders in ceremony and traditional medicine, and she draws on the healing powers and relationship with the natural world to guide her work. She also holds a degree in biology, psychology, and animal behavior. And she is the director of the Racial Healing Initiative and is the founder of Nepantla Healing and Consulting. She is the author of Real World Mindfulness for Beginners. And the best part of all is that she has participated as a ritual leader and speaker at least 3 Reimagine events in the past. So welcome back, Brenda. And finally, our facilitator tonight, Steph Sarazin. She is a writer, researcher, grief educator, and experiential expert in ambiguous grief. Her work began with her own experience of betrayal, and you'll learn a bit more about that. Her newest book, Soul Broken, A Guide for Your Journey Through Ambiguous Grief. She contributes to Psychology Today, Newsweek, HuffPost, etc. Please welcome our special guest. Steph, I'm handing the virtual talking stick over to you. It was your idea to focus on ritual for this final session on action. So I'm going to ask you, how has ritual been important to you as you navigated identity loss?
Oh, thank you. Great question. Thanks, Andy and Nicole and the team at Reimagine for having us all here today. I'm so pleased to be with everybody. And the short answer to your question is that it's been incredibly helpful. I would say even transformative. And you touched on it, Andy, when you said my experience with ambiguous grief began with the discovery that my marriage wasn't what I had believed it to be. After 20 years. And that was an experience that brought me to understand that without societal norms to engage in non-death losses, non-physical death losses, I should say, society doesn't really have much to offer grievers. And for me, myself, I found that during the process of my divorce that followed my discovery, I learned that physical death is not a prerequisite for grief. And I came to know so many people. I started to research to kind of try to understand why. I didn't want to grow up to be a grief educator or write about grief and loss. I have a master's degree in public policy, but that has helped me in that I was able to formalize some surveys and gather some data to try to understand what makes this grief different when we're grieving identity or we're grieving something without a physical death. And understanding that the rituals and ceremonies that we create in our lives to mark these important passings and rites of passage weren't available. There wasn't, something that I knew to do. I created it for myself out of just a deep inner knowing that I needed something. And so I called it a faux funeral. And I invited 2 friends with raised eyebrows. They came, and I planned and delivered, music that was important to my marriage. And I wrote a eulogy next to a lake with 2 friends who knew my marriage best, and a stunning blue heron who came and as I began to speak and who left when I stopped. And it was just a beautiful experience of the natural world. And something from that moment shifted in me. And my grief began to integrate in a different way. And since then, I've been a student of ritual and ceremony. And I'm so delighted to be in conversation today with Brenda and Sarah, who have so much wisdom to teach us. And I'd love to hear from both of you too, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about yourself, kind of also through the lens of ritual or through loss. Brenda, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Steph. I'm such a joy to be here with you all, and thank you for everyone who's shown up tonight. My name is Brenda, and well, thinking about identity loss and ritual, I feel like there's so many kind of rites of passage and ritual that I've gone throughout my life as an Indigenous person, but the one I'll focus on is the time when I entered into perimenopause and then into menopause, and just feeling a lot of changes happening in my body, a lot of grief around that part of my life ending, but also seeing it as a time to stepping into elderhood and a rite of passage. And I read this phrase in a book I read at that time that said, "She who holds her wise blood inside." And so there was a lot of celebration and joy around what it meant to be a woman in the earlier phases, and to reflect on the lessons there, but also kind of this grief and stepping through some kind of portal towards the next phase of that. Many rituals at that time, doing bajo ceremonies, which is a form of vaginal steaming ceremony with plant medicine to purify the womb area. Also Mayan abdominal massage, which we're supposed to do in our older age so that our organs don't drop. My mom went through some vaginal atrophy and her organs are dropping, having trouble, but our ancestors knew how to tend to the womb through ceremony and ritual. So that's kind of one of the lenses that I'm thinking about as I enter in tonight.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Steph. And thank you all. It's really so beautiful to see this many people coming on Zoom. Usually my Zooms are me and one or two other people, so it's beautiful to see all of you. So I have two short stories. So one is that I was a very active young Jewish girl who loved being Jewish and loved going to synagogue and loved all the being in choir and having my bat mitzvah, which is Jewish coming of age ceremony. And I felt at home in Jewish community, which I really don't take for granted at this moment in my life. And when my parents were when I was 15, my parents got divorced. And it was right when my brother's coming of age ceremony was. He was a few years younger. And so we had this ceremony, which was supposed to be my brother's coming of age ceremony, but it was really 3 months after their separation. And I remember my brother and I standing in between them during pictures, and just feeling like, oh, we have to hold this down because the ritual is actually about my parents separating, but we're pretending that it's about my brother's coming of age ceremony. And it was at that point that I started thinking, why are we pretending? Like, why don't we have rituals about what's really going on in our lives, right? Like, this is really happening to my family. And yes, my brother's coming of age, but through a lot of hardship. And we just totally didn't deal with that part. And that was heartbreaking for me as someone who thought, well, Judaism is big enough to hold all of it, the beauty and the challenge of life. And it wasn't for me in that moment, but I knew it was in the big picture. I knew there was much more to the story. And that's kind of my life, is trying to figure out what's the rest of the story about how tradition can inform all of the moments of our transitions. And I just want to share another little story because I think it might, just because there's such a breadth of people here, and maybe will speak to a different kind of person, which is that when my oldest was transitioning from preschool to kindergarten. There was a kindergarten welcome ceremony, like not ceremony, no, God forbid, but there was a kindergarten welcome thing for parents. And it was in an auditorium, and the principal was speaking, and there was a full room of anxious parents. And and people were asking wildly anxious questions. And I remember thinking, why are people so interested in what's for lunch for the kids? They'll be fine. Like, why is everyone asking these questions? And when I left, I realized it's a big transition to be a parent of a little one to a parent of a school age kid. And we didn't have a way to ceremonialize that. We didn't have a way to ritualize that. So there was just anxiety living in the room. And how beautiful it could have been, of course, like no one wants Rabbi Sara to lead a ritual at a public kindergarten like welcome day, but it was still to me like an opportunity to say, oh wow, like yeah, this is a big transition for us, and that brings up a lot. Like, who are you as a parent now? And so those are the kind of life moments where it would be so useful for someone to stop and say, okay, let's take stock of this.
Oh, that's terrific. You know, I really like that the both of you, just to kind of reflect back, the both of you spoke about transitions and about ritual as a conduit of transition. Brenda, you spoke about elderhood and entering elderhood, and Sarah, you spoke about entering preschool to kindergarten, right? So here we are at opposite ends of the lifespan. And to Sarah, as you're talking about the coming of age ceremony, just so we can all kind of get on the same page in terms of language, which was something that also was a big part of our conversation on, with Cole and Pari in our first panel. There's kind of this clinical language, and then there is around the kitchen table language. And so tell us, what is the difference between ceremony and ritual? Are they the same? Should we use them separately?
So in my tradition in Hebrew, those are not two different words, really. I mean, one could argue with me, and I would be happy to engage if one would like to argue with me. But I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, that we don't really separate out those words in particular, ritual and ceremony. But what we do have, and which speaks directly to what you just said, Steph, about like more formal and kitchen table, is are two Hebrew words. One is keva, which means fixed, and another is kavanah, which means intention. So ritual is perfectly reasonable to have fixed ritual, right? It's perfectly reasonable to have fixed ritual. You want fixed ritual, right? Like, we're about to enter into the Jewish holiday season. And it is really comforting for some people, some of the time, to know when the leaves start falling on the East Coast, it's Jewish high holiday season. And it's time to go eat apples and honey and have meals with your family and potentially pray if that's part of your tradition, and other pieces that are fixed as part of our liturgy, as part of our ritual. And again, I think it's comforting to kind of know what's going to come next. And then there's kavanah, which is infusing your own life experience and your understanding of meaning into ritual. And so, for example, there's an immersion ceremony that a person does before the holidays. And that immersion takes on a lot of different shapes and a lot of different forms, and can hold a lot of different kinds of transitions that have happened for you throughout the year that you're honoring. So the ritual is keva, the ritual is fixed, but the experience of the ritual is all about the kavanah. It's all about the intention that you personally bring and the meaning that you ascribe to it. So that is how I'm thinking of those two words. One could say ceremony is more fixed and ritual is more kavanah, creative. maybe, but I'll just leave it in my language for that.
Sure. Thank you. Brenda, do you have any thing to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm really grateful for a lot of the Indigenous elders in my life and different teachers and friends that I have. And one of them is a woman named Maritza Centeno, who's an Indigenous leader in Nicaragua. And she was up here doing ceremony with our women's circle. And one of the things she said was that if you learn to work in this way with the universe, with your life, with reflection, with transitions, you'll start to see everything as ceremony and ritual, whether it's taking a shower and thanking the water for clearing you. And it comes back to that thing you were saying about one's own experience, understanding, meaning, intention. Like if you do things with intention, everything becomes ritual. And I would say too, I don't have a distinction between ceremony and ritual. I just know that ritual is embedded in my life, and I have to be doing it all the time. And sometimes it's individual ritual that I'm doing. And sometimes, like this whole weekend, I was camping at Lake Chabot, and we were offering fire ceremonies Saturday night and Sunday night for people to think about this important transition of summer to fall, which was, we go far back enough, all of our ancestors were Indigenous and celebrated these transitions in particular ways. And so we had people come and do potluck dinner and think about like, okay, we're in a time of transition from one season to the next. And this time would have been marked by a lot of gratitude for the harvest that Mother Earth has given us. What are you grateful for in your life that you've been receiving? And then asking people to think about, okay, this is a time of transition. What transitions are you going through in your life? What do you want to share about that in community so we can hold that prayer, intention, blessing for you, whatever that is, the challenges and the gifts of that transition. And then what intentions do you want to lay into the fire to pray for yourself, for your family, for community, for the world, and all the transitions we're going through as a world. And so it's important also to have rituals that we do with each other in community, as well as individually on our own. There's so much about our modern society that is a little bit pathologically individualistic, and we've forgotten the need to be in ritual with each other and with the earth.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. And you said something that caught my attention. You said that ritual has always been embedded into your life. How is that for me, somebody growing up outside of ritual, outside of maybe, a birthday cake and the candles and the singing, not within a spiritual home or religious home, in that context, how has it been embedded into your life, and what role do your family members or your ancestors play in your connection to ritual today?
Definitely ancestors play a big part for me. I'm grateful that very young, so I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school the whole way. So there's a lot of ritual embedded in that, right? But then also as an Indigenous person, my grandmother was Indigenous Chorotega in Nicaragua. She died when I was a little girl, but much like her, very young, I felt a real connection and kinship with trees, with animals, with nature. I would say I was a really contemplative kid and would go off into nature and be quiet and sit under a tree. And that, to me, that's when I had the biggest downloads, connections with spirit, God, source, whatever you want to call that, was when I was in silence and in nature. And, that's what a lot of contemplative folks in different traditions access. And for me, that's always been about our direct relationship with source that's not mediated by an authority. And all religions and traditions had practices for doing that. And I think that's where we access the things that you spoke about, Sarah, that what is our intention? What is our meaning? We get that through being still and reflecting. And so for folks who perhaps weren't raised with so much ritual, I would say just creating the time and the rhythm where you're in activity and busyness, and then also in silence and in nature or meditation or prayer, whatever it is that is for you, that allows you to slow down and go inward and access what is true, your intuition, your feelings, your emotions, like to get out of the head. We're so really conditioned to be in our head in modern society, and to drop down to these other ways of knowing that want to help guide you around reflection and transition, grieving and growth. That's accessible to all of us, and it requires us to carve space to access it.
Thank you. It does. As I was preparing for our conversation, I looked online to find, the history of ritual. What might I find? And an interesting article came up that basically says that there is an excavation site in Israel. Archaeologists found almost 100 years ago. And it's a burial site. They believe it is scientists dated the bones, a 100,000-year-old burial site with tools, colored tools, and similar sites have been since found around the globe, showing that our ancestors, 100,000 years ago, can't even conceptualize that, right? Were burying with ritual, and that really struck me. So it seems to make sense that as human beings, we understand that ritual is helpful in death transition. And yet this is a series on identity loss and non-death losses. If we're, as a species, pretty intuitive, to your point, Brenda, about what we need, why is it that non-death losses don't have a word or a name, or whether it's clinical or not, that can, faux funeral was the closest thing I could think of to describe to my friends what I was inviting them to. Why don't we have that for non-physical loss? And what can we do to change that?
Well, I know when in our conversation earlier, Steph, I talked a little bit about how if we go far back enough, everyone on this call has ancestors who were indigenous to place and had ritual and ceremony with land, with ancestors, and for lots of different reasons, those things got lost. But what I will say is that if you go back to that time, everybody had rites of passage in which these transitions and moments of going from childhood to a young adulthood to motherhood to fatherhood to elderhood, and then eventually to becoming an ancestor on the other side. Those are all rites of passage. And those were things that were talked about in our communities, in our tribes, and then also there were public rituals around, okay, so you're going from childhood to adulthood. What did you enjoy being about a child, and what was the fun about that? And what are you grieving that you're leaving behind to step through this portal, become a young adult and become a warrior and a servant to your people? And what are the new responsibilities and ways you're going to have to stretch and grow? And you're initiated by people who have already been initiated. And so there is some understanding back then that we go through what I would call constant death, grief, rebirth into the next phase of our growth and development. And there was some kind of context in our community for understanding that we're going to go through these all our lives. It's part of what it means to be human, and part of what it means to be in ceremony with the seasons, so there, I think there was just more ritual embedded in our lives individually and collectively, and also understanding around the need to stop and to mark these important transitions. And in kind of this modern context of colonization, of commercialization, our worth has become our productivity. And then we don't feel like we have a right to slow down, or we feel like we're being irresponsible if we slow down. So I think that there's so much around the modern pace of society and productivity as our identity that has taught us to lose some of these things. But it's natural. It's part of being human and part of being connected to the life cycle.
Sarah, you're nodding.
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote in my notes, like, capitalism eats everything. So I just want to, yes, what you just said so beautifully, Brenda. And I also want to add that I think in the individualism, like as we kind of siphoned into individualism from collectivity, each ritual became your thing, right? So it's like your coming of age ceremony. So you invite people and they come and you pay for it, and it's expensive and it better be fancy. And like it kind of like we lost a lot of the collective, and it became your responsibility to have this for your life. And I also think there are public rituals there are, well, actually, I would say there are public transitions that we go through that many religions do a relatively good or solid job on, which is, birth ceremonies, that's happening. Coming of age, those are happening. Marriage, like coupling, and death. I call those, the big four. Like religion is okay or solid at the big four because that's and that's kind of inadvertently, I think, and I don't know exactly how this happened, but those became the only times you can ritualize your life, right? It became like or understood that way. Like, oh, those are the big four. I'm not going through a death like you shared earlier, Steph. Oh, I'm not going through a death, but I am going through a really big loss that feels like a death, but but I can't do the death ritual. That's not allowed. So there became like private transition, private loss and gain, like private loss and transition just became quiet. And then we lost the rituals for it. And there are so many invisible transitions in our lives. I mean, and so I would say, I mean, what I offer as a Jewish person is that we wake up every morning and we say, thank God for putting my soul back into me, which is a beautiful liturgy, in my opinion, because it's basically saying every night, a little bit of our soul, it's not clear. It's dark out and people get scared. And every night we wake up and we say, okay, my soul has been returned. So immediately we're saying we're grateful. We're connecting to God. We're honoring the mystery, right? Like all of that is happening in the first moment of waking up. And then there are blessings throughout the day. And then we have a week ritual, right? Which is our Shabbat, which is our Sabbath on Friday night to Saturday. And then every month we honor the moon. And then we actually call it 4 New Years. We have 4 different New Years, depending on who you're asking. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can mark time and ritualize collectively. And then that's not even honoring or fully integrating the invisible transitions. That's just the Jewish world's transitions, right? That we can put ourselves into. And that again is keva and kavana. Like you said, Brenda, like, okay, the season is changing. Who am I? And so I think, yeah, like how do we incorporate ourselves into what our tradition offers? And then how do we create ritual for us when our invisible transitions don't have another place and time to be honored?
Right. That is the big question. Thank you for that. I love that you said you named invisible transitions. I'm I don't know, maybe 6 weeks out from launching my youngest, and I'm living alone for the first time in my life. And it is a transition of my motherhood, those years of my motherhood in that way, and stepping into this space. And though I know I have several friends and acquaintances also in this space, if not, having already gone through it, it's there's nowhere named to go to honor it, to mark this important time. So of course I'm doing that by myself. Something that you both mentioned, and I know we're going to be going to question and answers here in just a few minutes, so I wanted to see if we couldn't touch on 2 things. And it's the idea of the action, right? So it's the idea of the doing. Is it enough to sing the song and do the thing and drink the drink or do the water, light the candle, and then that's the ritual? Is what do we need to bring to our ritual, whether it's one that has been created and we're enacting, or we're creating and devising? What more do we need to bring?
So I want to share a story about something that happened many thousands of years ago, which is that at the temple in Jerusalem, back when the temple stood, there were priests who would who would participate in the really dirty work of making sacrifices. And that was not like, that was a really challenging spiritual leadership role, in my opinion, because you're spending a lot of time moving the fat from one place to another and burning the stuff and making sure the smoke goes in the right place. Okay. So that's what they would do all day long. And that was sacred activity. And what they did before the sacred activity, I like to imagine a priest wakes up in his tent outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he walks up to the temple, and at the steps of the temple, we know, like you said, this archaeological, which almost never comes up. So I'm fascinated it came up twice, but there's like there's archaeological evidence in Jerusalem of mikvahs, of immersion pools that were carved out of the stone in the ground, that were carved out of the ground, that rainwater would fill. And they're sitting there right now, like in Jerusalem. And the priest would go in, would kind of have his coffee in the morning, you know, like have an argument with his wife, because that was what it was back then, you know, straight couples, and then come to the immersion pool and prepare to have a sacred experience. So, Steph, you might be asking, what is she talking about? Why is she telling this story? That's really wild. And what I just want to share is that preparation for doing sacred is, to me, the most important part of the ritual. Is like, what is my intention today? When those priests went in that pool, that I imagine they said, what is my intention today? How do I want to, in their case, serve God today? How do I want to honor these animals? How do I want to honor my people? And then they emerge out of the water, shifted in body and spirit, and then they can do their work. And so to me, it's evidence of this ancient yearning to prepare for ritual, so that it's not just, yeah, you light a candle and then you're like, okay, I did it. But it's really about saying, like, my body and my spirit are in some sort of alignment with this action that I'm about to take.
And what is the purpose or the role of community in that ritual being witnessed? And that's something that for people, you know, who have experienced ambiguous grief and are grieving the loss of a loved one or of an identity, part of themselves, grieving a shadow loss, as Cole and Pari taught us. How do we invite people to a ritual that we're creating? How do we find our people who won't raise an eyebrow, who will understand and gladly come to bear witness? Any thoughts? Brenda, you just talked about a fire. Yeah, you spoke about a ceremony recently.
Yeah, and I would love to jump in because, you know, related to your earlier question too. So there's something for us, I think, in one of the things I've noticed about all my elders in the indigenous traditions is about a lot of kind of humility, both the cultural humility, but also humility to be outside of just the human box, which I feel like this conversation is very human box oriented. So when this preparation for doing the sacred, what I've been taught is to call the directions. It's one of our things of like asking the elements and the directions to be with us, calling in healthy ancestors to be like, I know that when I'm doing these ceremonies for healing with people, healing them, healing their ancestral patterns that were passed down or their ancestral trauma, like I'm not healing them as Brenda the human. I am connecting with spirit and source. I'm connecting with the elements. I'm connecting with the healthy ancestors, mine and theirs, that want to support us in that ceremony. And I'm very clear that I'm not supposed to do this work without that connection. But there's also a humility that comes with asking for that support. That doesn't assume that Brenda the human has to have all the answers and have it all figured out. So that part feels really important to me. And I was just relating to a lot of things that you were sharing, because we have similar things. So I'm trained in Toltec, you know, calendar and practices. So we greet the sun and we have practices with the sun at different times of day, and we're storing energy with the sun at different times of day so that we have the life force energy that we need in order to take care of ourselves and our own healing and purpose in the world, as well as to help others who are coming to us to help us, that need help. Like my teachers have taught me, I see too many healers that heal out of their own life force. So you need to be storing for yourself and for others. And I don't want you to see you, because I see people healing other people out of their own life force, and then they're getting sick and depleted. And so that there's a discipline as well as a humility in that, right? That feels really important to me. I think that one of the things that feels most important too is, and this came up in the first call, is the importance of witnessing from your community and those who love you, and them holding space for you to share your story. So much of the healing traditions I've been taught, like part of it is moving the energetics of what the trauma has done to their body and their energy system, but also to be witnessed in their story without shame, without judgment, without, trying to tell them how to fix things, but just being witnessed feels really, really important, and relates to some of the questions I see coming up in the chat. But we're not supposed to heal alone all the time. There's aspects of our healing that we absolutely have to take responsibility for. But again, it's this capitalistic, pathologically individual thing that we're supposed to go off and fix everything by ourselves and present this perfect picture to everyone. We're not allowed to be our authentic human selves, and which means we're not in authentic relationship with each other. If we're putting on a facade all the time that we have it together, and if we don't have it together, then we just hide until we do. We're supposed to be strong, and we're also supposed to be vulnerable, and we're supposed to take care of ourselves, and we're supposed to take care of each other. And that's part of what it means to be human and be in community. And so I think part of it is, if you are going through those things, like creating your faux funeral, you're reaching out to the friends and saying, like, I'm going through this thing and I feel like I need to mark that passage in some way, and I want to invite you to this thing. And if it resonates for you, please come. And if it doesn't, that's okay. No harm, no foul. But to invite people in, and you'll be surprised. I've been invited to do a lot of rites of passage for friends whose daughter was coming of age into her menstruation cycle, and marking that passage to womanhood. And you'll find, some of those women, they're part of that culture already. But a lot of the women who went to that first one I did said, I didn't have this. And they were grieving and crying and saying, why didn't I have this? And now I'm going to start creating rituals with me and my women. I go to this global matriarchs gathering, and they went back and started doing ritual with their women in their community. So we can create this now anew. And it just because we haven't had the experience doesn't mean we can't invite our community and to start creating that again together.
Steph, Brenda, and Sarah, I wanted to get to a few questions that came through the chat. One is on moral injury, and there were a couple that addressed the theme of shame. So I'm going to try to paste these into the chat so we can all look at them, but I'll read them. So the first one is from Claire. When identity is fractured, shattered by grief, or shattered by trauma, how does ritual come into play, especially when that foundation isn't there to begin with? And I'd be interested in hearing thoughts about ritual for moral injury that comes with some types of ambiguous grief.
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that, Claire. And I turn to Sarah and Brenda for your insight. I'm learning right along with you both, with the audience. Oh, unmute, Brenda.
I'll share that one of the things I've been trained to do is cord cutting rituals. But I feel like there's aspects of it that anyone can do for themselves. So when someone is perhaps leaving a relationship and there's a lot of charge or story or powerlessness, those kinds of things, that's usually when we do cord cutting ceremony. It could also be with a toxic workplace or an unhealthy boss you were with for a long time, and how that's damaged you in many ways. And so that a lot of moral injury is often part of those conversations. And so when people come to me wanting to take their power back and do some healing around that, what I'll ask them to do is to take, if they're able to take a bath and to bring whatever herbs and candles and journal they want to bring into that. And I asked them to reflect on 3 questions. The first one is, what are you grateful for in the relationship or experience? The second one is, what do you forgive yourself for in the dynamic or the relationship that happened? Knowing that everything is a dynamic and, you know, we played a role too. And then the third is, what do you forgive the other person for in that experience? And there's always something to reflect on there. Maybe, you know, forgiveness for something they did, or forgiveness around the trauma they have that they were not able to deal with, that spilled out into the way they are in the relationship. And then once we've done that, so when we do this in my backyard, I'll have people holding, there's a rosemary plant I have a relationship with them from my house. I ask permission to take some of it, and then I'll ask them to hold that rosemary in their arms and their hands while they're answering those questions. We're in the ceremony space, in the ritual space. And once they've done that, I thank the rosemary for taking in the energy of that gratitude and forgiveness. And I ask it to cut the cords in the abdominal area between the energetic contracts with those people, and whatever power rightfully belongs to them that's still connected to that person, that they're getting that power back, and whatever power belongs to the other person, that they're giving that back, and declaring those lessons with each other complete. And then I give that rosemary to the earth, and I ask the earth to compost things. And I tell people this is not about condoning what somebody did. It's about demonstrating to the universe and to yourself, I get the lesson you were trying to teach me in this relationship. I'm done with that relationship lesson. I would like to move to the next grade. In relationship lessons, I don't want to keep repeating this lesson, because when we don't do that, I think we end up repeating the same lesson over and over again with the same person and different people. And sometimes it even escalates. So I'm always kind of thinking of that in that context when I'm in challenge and difficulty with other people, like, how do I stay in my love and my truth? And how do I move through this with integrity? As I release those relationships, or even stay in the relationship, but cut the cords of those contracts and agreements, and ask to form new contracts and agreements that are about the next level of our learning and growth and relationship.
I want to build on that and expand. First of all, I just want to say, Brenda, that is so beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I can picture it. And I think helping paint the picture of what we can just do in our backyards is such a beautiful offering. I also really love the word that you use, complete. We use, in a different ritual, I use the word complete at the end to show like you're whole without, like, that is moving on and you're still whole. Like whatever it is that you're letting go of, there's still like a completeness within you and wholeness within you. So anyway, really, I'm just so touched by what you shared. I want to I don't know if maybe, Andy, you want to ask a different question, or if I could just riff on the questions I'm seeing in the chat, which is really about like, how do I do this? What do you think, Andy?
I think we have time for that. I do want to get to these 2 related shame questions, but you
Okay.
Go ahead and riff.
Okay, I'm going to riff on how do I do this, and then we can go to shame. That sounds great. Thank you. I just want to offer that when I've done ritual facilitator training. So first of all, I think any of us can facilitate ritual and facilitate our own ritual and rituals for others. So I don't think you need a special, I mean, you need a very loving intention, which is what we talked about before, like kavanah and preparation. But I don't think you need much more than that to be able to offer ritual for yourself and others. And I think about just what Brenda has been sharing about herbs and fire and cord cutting. I think about like, what are the ancient materials that we were given from the earth to do ritual? And I have the 6 that I've shared with Steph. The 6 that I think of when I'm thinking of, okay, how do I want to enact a ritual for something that otherwise doesn't have one? I think about using oil, fire, water, salt, bread, and wine. that's what and maybe there's more, but those are the ones I think of, is like, those are the 6 that I think, okay, how can I use these materials to create a separation or honor a shift? And then I think about are the sensory elements, the ritual sensory elements that speak to me or the person I'm creating a ritual for. And when I say that, I'm thinking the ones that come to mind are music or no music, music with language, music without language, singing, like just sitting there and singing with someone, quiet, what kind of quiet, movement, what kind of movement, stillness, what kind of stillness, uh, communal, like, do we want to have 20 people there, or do we just want to have me and one other person who stands in as a witness for the whole community? And so I want to offer that just as my way, like the kind of the pieces I like to play on the puzzle or on the chessboard, or however we want to think about it, of how do I create a ritual that would honor this moment? And I think your cord cutting ritual, obviously it's not something you just put together, and yet it has a lot of these components of different ways that you have learned from your lineage and your people and the people you're in front of what they need in this moment.
Thank you, Sarah. So these 2 related questions from Jackie and Agape. Let's see. So, so many of these identity losses are tainted with the social conditioning of shame, divorce, menopause, loss of job, loss of friendship. I see that conditioning being challenged in things like divorce parties, showers, but it's not necessarily changing the shame associated with the changes. How might ritual address this? And then Agape's question, how do we find rituals to help us heal in and with community and stop hiding?
I would say that the more we do rituals for these experiences, the more it becomes allowed. No one can take that away. There is no authority other than you for what kind of ways you want to honor the transitions in your life. And so I have done many different kinds of rituals for this kind of ambiguous loss. And what I think is so beautiful is that every person who's at those rituals then thinks, when they go through their own loss, oh, someone can make a ritual for this. There's a ritual for this. And I do think and it's slow, like this kind of culture shift, we're fighting against all the other, the normative tides to say the opposite. So as much as we can allow this to be slow and to let each individual person who is going through a healing ritual, and their communities are learning about these healing rituals, and that is probably how it's going to grow and become more normative.
I agree with that. Yeah, little by little, right? A little becomes a lot. And I think by inviting people to bear witness, whether it's 1 or 2 or 10, for me personally, not only was my experience onset by divorce, there was betrayal, there was chronic infidelity that I discovered. And this was, it could be perceived as something shameful. I didn't talk about it for 3 months to anybody except those 2 folks because I didn't want to be talked about, right? But when I talked earlier about that shift that I felt inside of me after my funeral, it was empowering. The ritual allowed me to stand in the power of my experience and really see that there is no shame for me to carry. This is a normal and natural human experience, grief, whatever it is that onset your ambiguous grief, whether it's a divorce like mine or a diagnosis, incarceration, identity loss, estrangement. There's so many different things that can bring us here. And we're not so unique that we're the only person to have experienced it, right? It's just about finding our power, I think, and being able to then find our people. I don't know, it's a chicken or the egg, but it's a slow process, but I think it's one worth pursuing.
Brenda, any reflections from you on these questions on shame?
Yeah, I think as a community, the more we can begin to share story with each other. I think for just all my Indigenous teachers teach through story. It's not intellectual books and lists of things in the same way. When we see our peers and our elders, sharing both their strength and their vulnerability, including their grief, it makes it safe for other people to share their grief. So that's a big part of it. Yeah, and I question a lot, like what is shame really giving us? And so much of that is about performative stuff, right? Of expectations people have on us, expectations we have on ourselves, or expectations we had about our future. I know that came up a lot in the first call. I really got a lot out of that first panel, so I was grateful for it. Yeah, I think allowing space for our feelings, both the joyful, even the positive vibes only thing is not a good thing, because it's about not allowing us to have our full range of emotions. There's so much kind of ancestral clearing we have to do in the chest area that is about ancestral stuff. From the, in our calendar, we talk about the different suns, and we're ending the time of the fifth sun and beginning the time of the sixth sun. But there's a particular sun where we talk about where our ancestors in the past took on karma around our relationship to our feelings, and on the one extreme, shutting down our feelings and numbing our feelings so we don't have to feel our pain in an environment that didn't want us to do that. And then on the other extreme is rather than experiencing, feeling, moving through our feelings, allowing them to teach us what they're coming to teach us, and then moving through them. The other extreme is people, our ancestors, being solidified in a feeling. I'm an angry person, a depressed person, a sad person, and that's my identity, as opposed to something I'm moving through in this moment, that I'm allowed to feel joy and sadness at different points in my life. And a healthy relationship to emotions. We're honoring all of our wide range of emotions, regardless of who we are on the gender spectrum, that came up earlier as you were talking. Back in the day, there were people a lot of the medicine people were two-spirit people. Like, we had much more knowledge around the spectrum, and a lot of the people who were most in balance were the people who straddled and went against kind of the binary. We weren't binary in the Indigenous world in the past, and the binary has been posed in the colonial structure and the patriarchal structure. But anyway, just all that to say that there was a lot more fluidity in space. And how do we make space to reclaim that with each other, to create spaces where it's safe to be in our women's circle? We've been meeting for 13 years on the new moon and the full moon. And what we're doing in that space is learning to step into our purpose, our truth, our authenticity, but we're also vulnerable with each other and breaking unhealthy patterns that we've been taught to be gossipy, to talk about each other, to shame each other for not being perfect, for all those things. We need to come back to a world where there's empathy and support and listening and witnessing, not trying to fix each other, but supporting each other, that we have our own wisdom within. When we slow down and we're held in community, that we have, it's safe to access that.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Steph, and thank you, Sarah. We have to move now to the third element of our gathering here, which is the breakout rooms. There were some additional questions in Q&A, really beautiful, important questions from Karen and Judith in particular. And I'm going to try to pass those questions along to our speakers, and maybe after the fact, we can get some responses for the two of you that I can forward along. So thank you. So now, For those who can stay, we're going to run a little bit late, but I'm going to prepare our breakout rooms for us. It'll be 15 minutes long. I'm going to give you a set of prompts to work with. A few ground rules here. For those who opt in for the breakout rooms, you don't have to go in them. You can stay in the main room with me and Nicole. But we do request that if you do opt in, that there is a minimum of audio participation with a preference for video appearance if you can do that. But it's essential that if you're in a breakout room that you participate verbally. So thank you for that. Please be mindful of the time. Make sure that everyone has had a chance to share. It's not about giving advice or, as Brenda said, fixing things. It's about active listening and sharing your own experience. We'll be pasting instructions in the chat. For those who may need help while in the breakout rooms, you may want to leave, and we'll help you with that. So yes, we will be in the rooms for about 15 minutes, and then we will return for some final announcements. So, Nicole, if you are ready, we'll paste these prompts in the chat now, and I will try to broadcast them too while you're in the breakout rooms. The first, and you can reflect on any of these three prompts. You definitely don't do all three, but choose ones that speak to you. The first one is, how are you taking care of yourself as you navigate your identity losses? The second question is, what action, even a small, sweet step, can you take to transform your grief into growth? And the third prompt, what elements of ritual or ceremony would you include to mark your non-death loss? So now I am going to get us ready. While I get us ready, Steph, maybe you can elaborate a bit on the elements of ritual and ceremony, because this is something that you have addressed in a workbook that you have created.
Sure. Just kind of from a high level, for somebody creating a ritual on their own and working to incorporate meaning for you, I invite you to consider a 4-step kind of framework for doing that. It is remembering, reflecting, selecting, and then creating. And within that framework, it's essentially, taking a moment to remember, kind of a stream of consciousness writing where you're just a memory dump. You're not judging yourself with what's coming up, but you're remembering where in the world do you find your loved one? Be specific, and say, oh, that particular park bench by that particular tree, or be general and say in the summertime. Think about animals and things. Think about just what you heard Brenda and Sarah speak about today, elements of nature. You can think about ways that they were connected. Maybe it's a football team or a favorite author or an artist that reminds you of what you've lost, or what it is or who it is you're grieving. And then after you do this kind of, this remembering, you then continue to funnel it down to reflecting, and then you reflect a little more deeply. And this doesn't have to be done in succession. It might be a day or a week or a month after. It is when it is right for you and you're tuned into yourself to know when that time is. And then you reflect a little more deeply and you review that remembering and see what stands out. And I like to do this in a way where I listen to my body, and my body signals me, whether through a memory of smell or sound, or just feeling in my body. And I reflect a little more deeply on those different categories. And then after reflection is the selection. So now I'm looking at, these are the three places and the 3 animals and the 3 things and the 3 connections that remind me of this love I'm grieving, or this thing I'm grieving, this part of my life that I'm grieving. And I kind of put them together in one basket, and that helps to inform me how to create my ritual for releasing what was, creating space for what will be, and honoring what is. So it's just kind of a funneled system that helped me, and I invite you to take what you'd like and leave the rest if it might help you too.
Thank you, Steph. I'm going to move folks into the rooms, and I'll be moving folks around. Here we go. You've all been invited into rooms. And for those who want to remain with me, you're welcome to do so. Welcome back, everyone. I hope it was a good conversation with your groups. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for staying a bit late. So I just wanted to, well, if you wouldn't mind trying to mute the person whose mute is off, that would be great. Thank you. Once again, I want to thank all of those of you who already donated to Reimagine. You can still support Reimagine's efforts to provide free, accessible, and engaging support to folks facing the hardest parts of life. And please complete our survey. This is really important. We'd like to hear more from you about what has worked well in our offerings, what can be improved, and in general, what your interests are. So Nicole will be sharing the survey link in the chat. And while this experience is still fresh in your mind, we'd be so appreciative if you could fill out that survey now or a little bit later. You can view previous recordings of the Pieces of Me series by using the links we'll paste in the chat. And once again, we will be sending out a recording of this session along with more information about our guest speakers, Stephanie Sarazin, Brenda Salgado, and Sara Luria. Thank you to Steph, Brenda, and Sara for offering so much wisdom this evening. It's going to be very difficult for me to pull different clips that we're going to share out because everything was so juicy. So thank you. And I hope to see all of you at other Reimagine events. Thank you again. And we will see you soon, I hope. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. It's such a joy to meet you. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Brenda.